Thanks everyone for joining us. We're really lucky today to have Mr. Magwood, who's currently the Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency. I first crossed paths with him over 20 years ago when he was the Director of the Office of Nuclear Energy in the Department of Energy. And I think one of the close connections he has to our department was being part of the inspiration of our partnership with South Carolina State University, which goes on to this day. And it's something we're really happy to be continuing. Following his term at DOE, he went on to become an NRC commissioner and spent 5 years as a commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. After that, sorry, I missed a spot in there. In 2010, he became a commissioner of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to 2014, and following that, he went on to become the Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency, where I've had the opportunity to cross paths with him again there as part of some of the early meetings on the NEST program that I think he's going to talk about here in this talk and things like that. So really a great long service in public service to nuclear energy, and so it's a real pleasure for us to have you here. And with that, I'll let you go ahead and get started.
All right, excellent. Well, again, thank you for inviting me to come speak to this group. It's a pleasure to have a chance to chat with you. And as I was saying a few minutes ago, I'm sorry it's not in person. It would certainly be a lot more interesting to have to be in a room with all of you and be able to do an exchange on some of these issues. But hopefully, we'll be able to replicate that using this platform. But again, it's a great pleasure. And as you heard, I've certainly had some involvement with the University of Wisconsin over the years. The partnership with South Carolina State was really kind of a really unique and very beneficial activity that, as you heard, continues to this day. Maybe there's even some of you from South Carolina State they're listening in, I don't know. And clearly have always had a great deal of respect for the research activities at the university. So it's been a real pleasure working with Madison over the years. And what I'll do now is I'll go over some broad issues in policy and technology that we are dealing with at the NEA. But let me begin by talking to you a little bit about what the NEA is itself. So if you want to go to the first slide, please. All right, so the NEA is an association of governments. It was originally founded after the end of the Second World War in Europe. It was part of the effort to rebuild Europe in the aftermath of the war. And one of the things that European countries wanted to do was to begin to build expertise and capabilities in the nuclear energy area. So they formed an organization to help do that. But eventually, this organization went from being just a European group to being a global organization, which included the United States, Japan, Korea, eventually Russia, Argentina, and we have most recently even added Romania, and Bulgaria will be a member of the NEA in January. So we've been expanding a bit over the last several years. We also maintain partnerships with countries that are not in our membership, like Brazil, although Brazil has now indicated intend to join the NEA, so I'm very pleased about that. China, the UAE, and India, and we work very closely with all of them. Our framework revolves around the use of these committees and working parties that look at specific issues. These are staffed by people who are experts from our member countries, and each of these committees produces reports and analyses and common positions on a wide range of issues. And we really run the gamut of all civilian nuclear technology issues related to nuclear safety, radiation protection, technology, science, law, really the whole civilian side, as well as joint research projects. Next slide gives you a little bit more detail on the research projects. You can see on the right-hand side, many of our projects are related to nuclear safety, where we do research in areas such as fire propagation, hydrogen mitigation, radiation protection. We have several projects related to understanding the details of the Fukushima Daiichi accident, but our most recent project is relatively unique, and it's the Nuclear Education Skills and Technology Framework, and I'll talk about that more at the end. We are also the home for major international initiatives, the Generation 4 International Forum, which is now almost 20 years old, which is hard to believe. And the GIF is a group of countries that are working together to develop next generation nuclear technology. The Multinational Design Evaluation Program brings together leading regulators who take joint positions and joint analyze state-of-the-art technologies such as the ABWR, the AP1000, the Walloon 1 out of China, the VVR technologies in Russia, and several others, as you can see on the chart. And finally, the International Framework for Nuclear Energy Cooperation brings together 65 countries. There are both highly developed countries like France, Japan, and the United States to work with countries that are emerging into the nuclear field from Africa, the Middle East, and other parts of the world to work common issues such as nuclear waste, financing, human capacity building, and that sort of thing. So this, as you can imagine, keeps us pretty occupied. Now, obviously, over the last few years, one of the big drivers for us has been climate change. And the next chart shows that this really launched in a very significant fashion during the COP21 conference. If you can go to the next slide. There we go. And so when this happened, it really, I think, was a sea change in the international environment. There's certainly been a lot of discussion about climate change, reducing CO2, but there's never really a specific set of processes to try to drive countries in this direction. So this was a real achievement. It led to the idea to reduce CO2 emissions consistent with keeping global temperatures below that 2 degrees C threshold. And we had over nearly 200 countries sign on to this. Interestingly, in this conversation, energy really didn't play a big role in much of the conversation. Energy was largely not discussed specifically, but I think anyone who looks at the issue knows very quickly that energy is really where the action is when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions. And if you look at it overall, about 60% of all global emissions come from some form of energy use. And right now, about 3/4 of all energy comes from fossil fuels, oil, coal, natural gas. Some countries, particularly China, India, and several others, had highlighted in the conference that they saw nuclear energy as a big part of it. But what we see around the world is that not every country has taken that approach, obviously. Many countries have focused much more on renewable technologies, and that's been much more of a political decision as opposed to a practical one, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things that's really important to understand about this is that this is going to be extraordinarily difficult to achieve. The next slide shows some calculations that was done by the OECD. We're within the umbrella of the OECD, and their environment directorate did this work a couple of years ago, looking at if you understand that meeting the Paris Agreement means having a 50 gram of CO2 per kilowatt hour target, that means a major shift in how we make and apply electricity. And OECD countries are talking about the need to reduce emissions by 85%. And when you think about the extensive electric industry infrastructure we have in the United States and Europe and many other countries, that kind of reduction in CO2 emissions in a relatively short period of time is very, very hard to imagine. And really talking about a feat the like of which we've never really done in the world before. There's really no good analogy for this size of change. And the only thing I can even think of that even approaches it is the way the industry shifted its production during the Second World War, when we went from making cars and buses to tanks and airplanes. That was a massive shift, but this would even be bigger than that. So that shows you what we're up against. So in starting this, a couple of observations on the next slide, and that is to recognize that because of these policy imperatives you see around the world, the fact that so many countries and states in the US have set portfolio standards and have insisted on a certain percentage of variable renewable energy, we're going to see large deployments of variable renewable energy around the world. And that's not a bad thing. And I'm not here to criticize renewables. In fact, I think renewables are going to be essential to the future. But what we're seeing is that renewables are not having the impact that many countries had hoped. According to Eurostat, The EU finally, after many, many years of trying, has finally reduced its CO2 emissions. It had just gone steadily up over the years, but now it's actually coming down, but only about 4%, 2019. And when we looked at the numbers, we discovered that almost all of that had come from fuel switching between coal and natural gas. In fact, that renewables had very little impact on this number was really telling. And that was happening, and despite the fact there was a very large deployment of both wind and solar in Europe. Globally, we see that despite the massive investment in wind and solar around the world, annual emissions of CO2 continue to rise. In 2019, we reached a new high of 33 gigatons, and that's something that really shows that we have not bent the curve. So we're talking about major reductions, and we're still growing. So that's where things are. So we believe that the NEA, based on our analysis, if you're going to see this situation turn around, we're going to have to look at things differently. We're going to have to look at the economics of electricity supply in a way that enables us to decarbonize in a rational way, and not just based on rhetoric. So to move forward with this, we have done an analysis, and here the next slide shows two major reports that we came out with in the last couple of years. And let me say that all these reports, everything that we do, all of our work is available free of charge for download on our website. So feel free to go avail of that. So if you go to the next slide, please. So these two reports, the full cost of electricity provision and the cost of decarbonization, contain a lot of the analysis that that contain all the analysis I'm going to talk about in this presentation, but also much more. And to first focus on the full cost of electricity provision, the next slide highlights something that that you would think would be obvious, but apparently is not in many countries, and that is that when we see countries and policymakers talk about the costs of electricity sources and the cost of, say, of nuclear electricity versus electricity from a bank of solar panels or from a farm, we find that they're almost invariably talking about plant level costs, the actual cost of generation from that source. But the picture is actually much more complicated than that. It really includes both grid level costs, which is the cost of actually providing this electricity in the system, and also much larger costs associated with sociological environmental impacts. A good example being that the use of fossil fuels leads to heart disease and lung disease that kills hundreds of thousands of people around the world every year, and that's never really reflected in the decision making of policymakers when it comes to energy. And certainly there's nothing that's valuated in the pricing of electricity to show that there's a high cost in terms of human lives and environmental impact. Now, that outer band is really difficult. We didn't really quite figure out how to calculate those things. There's a lot of people who've written papers on this, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But we absolutely do know how to do grid level costs, and that's really what we're going to focus on this point forward. So the combination of plant level costs and grid level costs, that's what we mean when we say systems costs. And let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. The next slide, please. So what are the system costs? So the system costs include these plant level costs, but also these grid level effects. And to give you a sense of what this looks like, there's really three major components. The first one being profile costs. And profile costs basically are very straightforward. Let's say you have a lot of your system is based on solar. So at noon, you're really in great shape. You have low cost electricity. You probably have more electricity than you can use, and you can dump it on someone else's grid, and everyone's happy. But at midnight, there's no sun, and you're not getting any solar electricity. Therefore, something else has to kick on. In most cases, we're talking about gas turbines to make up the difference, and when that solar is not available. And there's a cost to that. There's a cost to maintaining that infrastructure and to having those systems come on after the sun goes down. And when it comes to balancing costs, it's a very similar sort of thing. Let's talk about wind. So wind is based on lots of very sophisticated calculations that the operators make to understand when the wind density will be at certain levels over the course of the day. And sometimes that just doesn't work out. Sometimes the wind just doesn't blow when it's supposed to, and they're prepared for that, They have systems that kick on when the wind doesn't blow enough to make up the difference, to keep the grid in balance, but there's a cost to that, and those are balancing costs. And then finally, the most easy to understand, obviously, is the transmission and distribution costs. Renewable capacity is very rarely where the demand centers are, so there always is going to be a very substantive cost to transmit the electricity from where the wind and the solar capacity is located, except for the case of, say, rooftop solar, which is a very different situation. But there's a cost to the transmission, and then when you add that up, these costs become the system costs, which are actually quite substantive. The next slide shows one of the effects that comes out of this calculation, and in terms of thinking about residual costs, excuse me for that. When it comes to the residual demand associated with electricity, you can see that in the chart on the left, when you have about 10% renewables, which is pretty close to what most grids look like, this is quite well within what grid operators normally see. You know, even if you didn't have any renewables, a grid would look a lot like this because there's variations over the course of time as things. You know, if you have trams, the trams come on in a certain part of the day, that gives you more demand. At night, it goes away. People use their air conditioner a certain part of the year, you know, so there's always these variations of demand, and grid operators are very good at managing that, and they have the capacity to make up these differences as the demand goes up and down. If you go to 10%, or if you go to 75% variable renewables, very high load, which is probably higher than we know how to do, you see this very exaggerated residual demand curve. And I've talked to the grid operators about this, and they've all said to me that we actually don't know how to do this. There's no technology that would enable us to manage that kind of exaggerated profile. And even if you did, notice that a significant amount of the electricity generated would be wasted. Unless you were able to dump it on somebody else's grid, which is somewhat what happens today in Europe, where you have excess capacity and it gets dumped onto someone else's grid, destroys their markets, and that's not your problem, I suppose. And so this is something that's a real issue. How do you manage that? And how do you pay for those costs? The next chart sort of summarizes the analysis. If you want to go to the next one, please. And it shows that if you look at the base case, which is a very modest amount of renewables, kind of what we see in most grids today, up to about 10%, you see that the cost is about half what it would be if you had 75% renewables. And that is really where the system costs kick in. So basically, these system costs at very high loads of renewables essentially double the cost of electricity in the system. More to the point, if you go to the next slide, one of the things that the analysis highlights, if you go to the next one, please. One of the things that the analysis highlights is the fact that we have this autocorrelation mechanism with renewables. Give me a second to try to catch up to the slide. Not working? There we go. All right, so the autocorrelation, this is very simple, and many of you I think are familiar with this. If you have a lot of solar, and let's say everyone's using rooftop solar, it all comes on at the same time. The sun comes out, everyone's solar kicks in, and everyone makes electricity. And that sounds like a really good thing, but what it does is it completely destroys the value of the electricity. So therefore, what we find in our analysis is that variable renewables will almost never be self-supporting and using market prices. There's just no way to do it because of the nature of how they operate. So despite the fact you hear a lot about the fact that the cost of wind and solar is coming down, which it is, if you look at it from a market standpoint, it doesn't really work very well because you always have this autocorrelation issue, and it destroys the market of the capacity. This is actually a pretty significant problem because what it means is that when we think about the grids of the future, that we probably are not going to be able to use markets the way we have in the past. Now take a look at the next chart. You know, we used to have markets very driven by prices and how much the price of electricity from different sources were and how people made choices, and then utilities would gain revenue from those from those prices to make investment in plant and equipment. And that's just not really happening anymore. And you look, and this chart's actually quite striking. This is from one of our sister organization, the International Energy Agency. And what this shows is that the vast majority of markets today, when it comes to investment, are basically investing in markets that are regulated. They're controlled by governments. And what we're seeing is that this is actually expanding rather than shrinking. You know, we used to talk about liberalized markets, and I find a lot of countries still like to pretend that they have liberalized markets, but the reality is they're regulated markets, whether they're directly regulated or indirectly regulated. And this means that we're not really developing markets that are providing the price signals and providing the revenues that industry would be able to use to invest in the future. So this is a significant problem. And what I find is that there are many analysts and NGO groups, particularly the ones that are most concerned about climate change, that will basically tell you, and they have told me, well, that's fine. Markets are a 20th century idea. We don't really need markets. What we need is to get rid of the CO2. And the best way to do that is for the governments to seize control and just tell people what to make and when to make it. And I think most of the people who know anything about economics know that governments are really bad at that sort of thing. So I'm not sure it's the best approach, but this is where we're heading. So here's some broad conclusions on the next slide. One of the broad conclusions that we have come to, and this is something I think you've heard from pretty much everyone who's looked at this, we really need everything. We need all sources of low carbon technologies. But what we are saying is that you're going to have to find a way to optimally apply these sources of low carbon electricity. And the markets ideally would be the way to do that. Markets have always been the way that we have allocated resources, but the markets don't work. The markets in Western countries are so completely broken, so completely distorted by requirements and regulations that they simply don't work that way anymore. And they are not enabling us to apply our resources effectively. So one of the things that the NEA has been doing, that we have been offering a service to member countries to do a system cost analysis in their markets so they can see what their options really are if their markets had actually been working. But what we really need to do is to fix the markets. We really need to see the markets modernized, and we do think that carbon pricing should be a part of that. So we see in that respect that countries are determined to deploy large amounts of VREs, and as I said, we're not really against that, but it would be much better if they knew what made sense, if they knew what made economic sense in terms of variable renewables versus dispatchable resources. And I think when they do these calculations, they're going to find that that with today's technology, if they can get 30 to 40% variable renewables on their grid, that's probably about optimal for most countries. There might be some that can go higher because they have the right resources, but for most countries, it's probably a maximum of 30 to 40%. And after that, things get very unstable. So even if you say, let's be optimistic, let's say it's 50% or 60% variable renewables, that still leaves 40% of the market that has to be filled by something else. And if you're trying to reduce CO2 dramatically, you don't have a lot of options. And one of the options that you do have is nuclear, unless you happen to have a lot of hydro. Most countries don't. So this presents a real opportunity for nuclear. So you would think this would put the nuclear industry in a very powerful position, and then really it should. But there are some issues. And one of the issues, of course, is cost. And this is something we hear from a lot of countries. The good news is, if you go to the next slide, that when you look at, we do the analysis, and this is analysis that people have done for many, many years, looking at the levelized cost of electricity over periods of time, we find that nuclear is still a good investment. I mean, this actually surprised even me a bit because I wasn't expecting it to come out quite this low. And what you see in this chart is that nuclear remains competitive with basically everything across the board when you look at it over a long period of time. And extending the lives of existing nuclear power plants is really the cheapest way, and it always has been. We always knew this, to have low cost, low carbon electricity. So nuclear does very well, but the problem is, and the next slide shows this, this isn't how people make decisions. This isn't how governments make decisions. And I will tell you that I have met with ministers from around the world, and we've talked about this LCOE analysis. And I remember one minister looked at me and said, look, you know, this is all great technology, but if we can't afford to build it, It's just having the conversation, and that is really the issue. How do you reduce the cost of nuclear to make it to get away from the sticker shock? This analysis we did a few years ago shows nuclear at $6,000 per installed kilowatt. And the reality, and this is based on a generic assessment we did, but the reality is that when you look at the projects the last several years in Finland, France, the United States, the number is actually about twice that. And that's just simply not sustainable. The reasons for it are quite straightforward. It's because we haven't been building plants. We're not that good at it anymore. We don't have the supply chain. We don't have the project managers. The rate infrastructure isn't really prepared for building new plants. And all this leads to higher and higher costs and delays. And we've seen the results of that in South Carolina and Georgia. The good news on this, and I suspect we always suspected this would happen on the next slide, is that we have learned lessons from these experiences. If you look at what we've learned, next slide, please. If you look at what we've learned from building the AP1000 in South Carolina and Georgia, for example, we now have supply chains in place to build AP1000s. We now have project managers who know how to build the plants. We now have worked out the bugs and the complexities in the regulatory system for Part 52. We've learned all these lessons. So so if you built another AP1000, you would probably find that you could build this much closer to the projected cost than you would have been able to 10 years ago. Of course, the trick is that who's going to sign up for the next AP1000 given what's happened, and that brings us to a very salient point about this technology, about the Gen 2 and Gen 3 reactors. Next slide. This technology's been a huge success, and it's always really distressing to me to hear people talk about nuclear like it hasn't been a success. European countries often avoid talking about nuclear at all, but nuclear helped build Europe after the Second World War. Europe benefited dramatically from the installation of large numbers of nuclear power plants that provided reliable, low-cost electricity to help rebuild the European economies and industries, and did so for decades. And so it's been a tremendous success story. While certainly the Fukushima Daiichi accident was extremely disturbing, we learned lessons from that. The fact is that there's really nothing about Fukushima Daiichi that would tell you that nuclear plants are not safe. There were a lot of very particular circumstances that were associated with that. But around the world, nuclear has been operated with excellent safety records. And even in Fukushima Daiichi, no one died from radiation exposure from the accident. So this is something that is just a reality. And then nuclear, as we know, provides this highly reliable, dispatchable, zero emission energy. However, if you hit the next bullet, please, we still have one more, please. We still have the reputation, the hangover from these projects that have gone so badly over the last 15 years or so. The idea that we actually did lose a company. We had a nuclear utility go into bankruptcy and disappear because of a nuclear project. And this makes it very difficult to go to a board of directors today and say, I want to build a nuclear power plant. Next bullet. These costs are really not in keeping with where the markets are today. We have very, very low costs of electricity, and there's just no way to justify $10 billion nuclear power plants in this market. And as you know, it's very difficult to even justify keeping existing nuclear power plants in operation, despite the fact that they are the best way to reduce CO2. There's no way to keep them operating in markets where the electricity prices are so low. And those prices are low for not good reasons all the time. Many people raise nuclear waste disposal as a big issue. I personally don't see nuclear waste as a big problem, but we'll talk about that more if you like. We know how to manage nuclear waste. We know how to dispose of nuclear waste. In Finland, they are now in the final stages of implementing a nuclear waste repository, which I have visited. I think it's going to be a tremendous success story and an example to others. But nevertheless, from a public perspective, this is a big issue. And finally, in that last bullet, in the aftermath of the accident in Japan, clearly public concern still exists, and there's some places where they simply will not allow for the construction of these Gen 3 reactors. It just simply isn't in the cards right now. So these factors have led to a tremendous spurt of innovation and interest in new technologies. And new technologies, next slide please, have basically been captured by this moniker, small modular reactors. And these small reactors present some really interesting characteristics. New ways of deploying nuclear technology. Instead of building one big, large 10 or $15 billion nuclear power reactor, you build many small reactors that could possibly be manufactured in factory at high quality. And we often make this analogy that we're talking about something that looks a lot like building an airliner. Instead of building something that looks like an airport, large, complicated, one-of-a-kind piece of infrastructure, maybe we need to be building airplanes and put them in factory and have the same thing being produced in large numbers. When I say large numbers, probably hundreds of units instead of one or two reactors. But these things are more flexible and they have very, very high safety performance. And this is something I think is most interesting to me. This chart shows a picture of the NuScale concept, which I know you've all been hearing a lot about since it recently got its final design approval from the NRC. This technology theoretically should be able to be operated without offsite emergency planning. That is a game changer. And there are countries that I have talked to that have told me that they would never have built a nuclear power plant before looking at this technology, saying, if I can put a nuclear reactor and make electricity without reducing CO2 and be able to tell people there's no chance of an offsite impact, he said that's something we're interested in. So this is really a big change. Now, the interesting thing about this SMR issue is that SMRs are all not the same. Next slide, please. There are really many categories of SMR, and they're all very different. And I think the biggest differences show up mostly in regulatory space. We go from basically small light water reactors all the way up to Gen 4 reactors, and they're all very different. And I'll just give you a very quick snapshot of each one of these. And we now think there's about 70 different projects around the world to develop these advanced technologies. Take a look at the next slide. And this is the first of the small modular reactors. Next slide, please. The first of the small modular reactors to really appear in the conversation were these small single unit LWRs. And I remember when they first started to come up, people were interested in talking about replacing all these small coal units in places like the Midwest and maybe in small countries where they were operating these little coal units. We need to get rid of those and replace with these small nuclear power reactors. And so there's a lot of interest in this. Many countries have been developing these types of technologies. And some of these I think have some real potential, and we'll see where they go. There's also great interest in these multi-module. And next slide. And this is the idea where you simply have a baseload power plant, a central station of similar size to what we have today. Next slide, please. But instead of being one large reactor, you have multiple small reactors. And this is really the NuScale approach, where you have, in the case of NuScale, 12 units inside of the system, and each one can be operated independently. And this is really tremendously flexible. So it's something that has a lot of very high interest for a lot of people. And so this is another one. But these are light water reactor systems, so they really still have a lot of the characteristics of light water. The game that NuScale and some of the others play, of course, is to have huge water inventory so that whatever scenarios you can come up with, there's enough water to keep the systems cool and safe until you reach air cooling. And that's the key to most of these systems. The next slide shows another area, which are mobile reactors. The only countries really emphasizing this right now are China and Russia. I have visited the floating nuclear power plant in Russia, and that's a fascinating system. It's based on it's basically on icebreaker technology that the Russians have been working on for years and years and years. There's lots of questions about these technologies from a regulatory standpoint, from a legal standpoint. And so there's a lot of work yet to be done on this. but it is a very interesting area, and there's a lot of countries interested in seeing where this goes. The next one is one that I have found is of very high interest to our friends in Canada. If you go to the next one, please, the MMRs, the micro modular reactors, and these are very, very small systems. You can see from the numbers that would be used and perhaps to power single factories, to power mines, remote communities, and there's a lot of interest in this around the world. And as I said, particularly Canada is particularly interested in using it for mines and for remote communities where they currently have to ship very, very expensive fuel oil to power diesels. They'd like to replace those, and they think this might be the way to go. Again, lots of questions about regulatory issues, security issues. We'll have to see where this takes us. And the final one, of course, my personal favorite on the next slide are the Gen 4 systems. And what you might be surprised about if you haven't looked at this is that the vast majority of SMR systems that people are looking at around the world are actually Gen 4 systems. That was a bit of a surprise to me when I figured that out. I would have assumed that most of it would be light water, but actually the large majority are actually Gen 4 systems looking at high temperature gas, molten salt, various fast reactors. And I think the idea is for many of these, they're trying to solve issues like nuclear waste, and they're trying to bring a completely fresh perspective. And I applaud the effort, but it also means that you won't be able to take full advantage of the long experience we have with light water technology when you go before the regulators. So the question is, are the regulators ready for these technologies? And that's remains to be seen. One thing that's really interesting about this on the next slide is that governments are not taking the lead with this. And this is really quite unique. And through the history of nuclear, most of the innovation, most of the advanced development was powered by national laboratories in the United States or around the world from other governments, where government funding was provided to government laboratories to go develop these technologies. For example, the integral fast reactor in the United States, the high temperature gas reactor in the United States, all funded by government. But we're now moving away from that. And most Western countries have seen that their attempts have failed in the past. They have not been successful in deploying new technologies. And they have been enamored by what I call the SpaceX model, the idea that with a little incentive, the private sector can just take it and go do amazing things. And that's what governments are now hoping for. And except for perhaps in Russia and China, that's what's happening. If you go to Europe, you look in the US, Canada, Japan, there's really a high expectation the private sector is going to take the lead here. There are some, this has got some promise to it. There's a lot of energy out there, but of course, there are some challenges ahead. The next slide shows that, that we will never completely get away from the government. The first bullet, please. The thing that is probably most important to point out is that all this is very expensive. While, a lot of these technologies to go from concept on paper to deploying a first of a kind unit, we're talking about billions of dollars. It's just not going to be inexpensive. I remember when I was at the Department of Energy, we did it's kind of a generic assessment. How much would it cost to take a Gen 4 technology of any type and actually bring it to commercialization? It was $2 to $3 billion, and I think that holds up today. And so it's going to be expensive, and it would certainly be helpful if we could share those costs internationally. But we also need to make sure that when these technologies become available, that they have a market. If Boeing builds a new airplane, they don't build it just for the US market. It would never be cost effective to do that. They build it for the global market. So these reactors have to be similar. They have to be built for a global market, and we have to find a way to give them access to a market. That's going to be no mean trick. That's going to be something very difficult. And the last bullet on this slide, it's going to be the regulators who are going to decide whether this is going to work or not. One more click, please. Yeah. So regulators can become the showstopper or not if they don't find a way to work together to make it possible to deploy these technologies around the world. So I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of highlights. Just First, next slide, please. I want to tell you a little bit about the NEST program. So we've launched NEST. It was under construction for about 2 or 3 years, a bit more complicated than we expected. The idea behind NEST is to have real-world research projects that will be overseen by professional scientists at laboratories in different places, but the work being done by students, by people in graduate school who are aspiring nuclear technologists. And this is aimed to create the next generation of subject matter experts around the world. And you would be surprised that there are many, many countries very interested in this. Next shows some of the projects that are already underway. We have 4 projects that have already gotten started, and they include projects in nuclear safety. They're based in Switzerland. An SMR project is cooperative between Canada and the United States. Robotics on decommissioning from Japan. And one of my favorites is the Russian project on radiated graphite, which is sponsored by Rosatom. Is really interesting because in that particular case, we really don't know what the answers are. It really is completely open research, and they're going to bring students into this up front. So I think it's going to be really exciting. In the countries, we currently have 11 countries that signed up to NEST, including countries like Italy and Germany, which have policies that say that we don't want to have nuclear in the future. So this is really a very, very broad research program. We have 3 others that are in preparation. I expect those to be approved this coming year. Currently, we have about 100 involved in all the NEST projects, and I expect that we will see more as time goes on. So that's something we're really excited about. Final thing I want to tell you about is something is just, if you go to the next slide, and this is probably one of the more exciting things that I've been involved in, is that we now have launched and is now official. The NEA will launch the Global Forum on Nuclear Education, Science, Technology, and Policy. And what is that? This is, so nuclear's been around for 60, 70 years. There's never been a global framework for nuclear educators around the world to work together. They certainly have some interaction, mostly bilateral, but now we will put in place a framework for global cooperation, global coordination of nuclear science and technology education to involve not just doing work with each other, but also giving creative thinking to the government sector through us. So this is something we're really excited about, and we'll be putting all the pieces of this together over the coming several months. Next slide just gives you a picture. This is an exploratory group we brought together from around the world. We tried to make sure it was regionally balanced. We had about a third from North America, a third from Europe, and a third from Asia. And this group came together, and they had some very substantive conversations. And one of the things that came out of this was they identified 4 areas of potential study that we expect to pursue. And you can see the areas here include the future of the nuclear engineering discipline itself, which is something that the people in this room were very concerned about, rethinking the relationship between nuclear energy and society, revitalizing the innovation culture in nuclear, and achieving gender balance in nuclear technology and academic workforces. So these are 4 areas initially, and probably more will come, but this is where we're going to start. So very excited about this. So I have one last slide that I will end with, and that is, and this is a little bit more philosophical perhaps, and that is that I'm often amazed by how much, when people are talking about dealing with the climate change issue, that they want you to give up things. In Europe in particular, I hear about people who say we have to stop eating meat because it's bad for the environment. And as you can see in this slide, lots of people riding bicycles. That's because some people think we shouldn't be using cars anymore because it's bad for the environment. And then we had the young lady that came to New York in a sailboat and with the message, well, we don't need airplanes. We can take sailboats across the Atlantic. And then I hear people tell people in developing countries, well, you don't really have to have middle class. You can just wait a little longer because it's bad for the environment to have all these people in the middle class. This is a loser. This is not going to work. The public is never going to accept giving up the benefits of a civilization to save the environment. Hit the last bullet, please. And if the answer to solving the climate question is giving up Western civilization, giving up economic growth. One more bullet, if you can hit it for me, please. Giving up the freedom of movement. People are going to say no. And I believe that nuclear energy is part of the solution to be able to say, you can eat your cake and have it too. You can both save the environment and continue to have economic expansion around the world. That is what nuclear brings to this conversation. And that is something I think that we need to emphasize. And that is the way to present the climate challenge to people in a way that isn't about sacrifice as much as it is about advanced technology. And I think we can do this. And nuclear, along with renewables and other sources, are really the road to get there. So with that, I think that is the end. I can show you the last slide, which is just a picture of our office building in Paris. You know, feel free, if you're ever in Paris, please come visit us. We'd love to host you. So with that, I think we have time for some comments and Q&A, and be happy to answer any questions you have.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bill. That was a really interesting presentation, and you can see it is because of the number of questions we have lined up here. I guess I'll quickly say I forgot to mention to those of you in the audience that Mr. Magwood is the one who coined the phrase Generation 4 reactor. So 20 years later, I think we're all just used to that word being around. But one of my first encounters was when the Generation 4 International, the Gen 4 roadmap exercise back in the early 2000s. So.
Yeah, I should have copyrighted that.
All right, the first question is to ask about which technologies you've considered that have the best chance to significantly reduce the nuclear energy costs.
Well, you know, that's a really good question, because I think that it depends when you say technology, I don't know if you mean which reactor technologies or which manufacturing technologies. I mean, I think we need them all. My belief, though, is that if you're going to significantly decrease the cost of nuclear generated electricity, that you have to move towards systems that have inherent safety characteristics. Because part of the cost of building and operating nuclear power plants is all the infrastructure that goes about, including the regulatory infrastructure, to make sure that the reactors stay safe. If you can have technologies that inherently protect the fuel, either through physics as opposed to through mechanisms, you can reduce the cost. And I think you'll see that even in the light water systems like NuScale, by just having huge amounts of water. But I think systems like molten salt systems, where you have low pressure systems that basically there's nothing to melt, you can reduce the cost even further. So this remains to be proven, but I believe that is the key to the future, to go to those types of systems that are, I guess I would call them, not, you know, where safety isn't really the issue anymore, because it becomes cost. And if you make it safe, so safe that safety is no longer in the conversation, now you're in a position to reduce costs. I think that's really the key to the future.
All right, another question. This one comes from Emma, and I don't remember which slide it was, but she's asking about CO2 emissions and the life cycle emissions from construction, transportation, and et cetera, and whether we really can consider these zero emission energy if we consider the life cycle emissions. And maybe you had a slide which showed some of those emissions, and I'm not sure whether you for life cycle or not.
Yeah, I don't remember if I showed an emissions chart for each energy technology, but every energy technology has infrastructure, and you know, some of it is at the plant, and some of it's in the manufacturing, but they're all there. And so, yes, you can certainly compare the life cycle total emissions that come into play when you build a nuclear power plant, especially if you have a big, large light water reactor, which has a lot of concrete, so there's a lot that goes into that. But you're also going to see the same thing, because, you know, somewhere there's a factory making wind turbine blades that had to be set up, and there's going to be a lot of CO2 associated with that. So you can say that about everything. So I think that's not really that's not a useful part of the conversation, because, you know, once you build these facilities, they're going to be operating for 40, 60, 80 years. That's where we really need to be taking action. And if in the future, if we're able to have zero emission technology, there's providing the energy, not just for electricity, but for heat and other things, then even in the future, when you build these systems, you'll have much less CO2 impact than you do today. but today, we're still relying on fossil fuels, so there's going to be CO2 associated with building anything.
Right. Great. Thanks. Another question about the 40% variable renewable energy in the grid. I think you said that your analysis shows that that's kind of an upper bound or a sweet spot. Other number, various people come in with other numbers all over the place. So what is it that sort of, how did you arrive at that number, and what gives you the confidence that that's the right number compared to some of the other estimates?
Yeah, like I said, that's kind of a ballpark for what we think for most grids that makes sense, and a lot of that comes from just simply how you manage the grid. What is manageable in terms of the variations of supply, and we've talked with grid operators, particularly in Europe, not so much in the U.S., about what can you actually manage and what does the technology support. And what we found is, and there's really actually a very good EDF study, which I don't remember the quite name, but if you can look for it, you can probably find it. Excellent study that went into great detail of this, and they basically found that when you get much above 40%, reliability starts to go down very dramatically. You start to see a lot of instability in the grid. Now, in the future, perhaps there'll be new technologies that'll help mitigate some of this, but it's not there today. And although a lot of people talk about storage, I find this very interesting. I find that a lot of people in the electricity business have largely started bypassing storage as a significant part of the long-term solution. They see storage as something that manages short-term variations, but when it comes to the longer-term variations of days or weeks, it's useless to them. So that's something that we have seen. And so that's where the 40% number comes from. It's just a matter of where the grid remains stable. And again, that depends on what resources you have, because there'll be some resources where perhaps you have huge amounts of high density wind, and so maybe you can find a way to arrange the wind a bit differently, or the solar. But for most systems, you're really in that 40% range.
Great. Another question, maybe sort of a good segue, is talking about load following. While nuclear plants can load follow, it causes them some stress technically and economic stress sometimes. Have you at NEA looked at the viability and the economics of coupling to large-scale industrial processes that can adjust their power consumption to match and rely on that for the load following rather than the reactor?
Well, we haven't looked at that. I haven't looked at that. There might be people on my staff looking at it, but what we have looked at more is the idea that nuclear should be not just producing electricity, but could also be doing other things. The same nuclear heat could be used for industrial heat purposes, for manufacturing, or it could be used to be making clean water or some other products, and that might be a more cost-effective way of having a flexible nuclear infrastructure where you just basically make either electricity, water, or heat, depending on what the market required. I think you might find that makes a lot more economic sense than simply ramping the expensive nuclear power plant up and down, depending on what the wind is doing. So that's something that I think that over time we're going to have to become smarter about how we do these calculations, because I think you might find for many countries it just simply doesn't make sense to load follow using expensive nuclear power plants. And there might be a better solution. But we have looked at the idea that having more flexible products for nuclear power plants, and of course there's a lot of studies from NREL and other places on these hybrid systems that merge renewables and nuclear and industrial applications, and everything's all bound together. It gets very complicated, but that might very well be what the future looks like.
Great. And maybe we'll squeeze in one more question here. Are the NEST projects jointly funded by the NEA and the host country? And sort of related to that, do they need to couple into the larger efforts in the host countries? Or how does that relationship work?
So the way the NEST is structured is that the 11 countries I mentioned, which includes, as I said, Germany, Russia, the United States, Japan, many others, they contribute to a fund, and so there's a pot of money that gets distributed to NEST projects, and there's a NEST board composed of all the contributors who decide which projects to finance. And so the money that's used that comes from NEST is used not right now, because NEST isn't big enough yet, to fund the actual research projects as much as it is to fund the interaction and incorporation of students into the programs. So students can go to PSI and travel there and spend time, and NEST covers the cost of that, but not the cost of the research they're doing. So it really relies very heavily on existing research projects, or research projects that universities intended to do in the first place, or laboratories intended to do, and leverage those projects to get students into them. So that's how NEST has been structured so far. I like to see NEST grow to the place where we can actually launch our own research projects, but that's an order of magnitude more money than we've been collecting so far.
All right, well, I think that wraps up our questions just on time. Thanks for a really great presentation. It's nice to see a good summary. I know, I've seen bits and pieces of the NEA work over the years, but I think this was a great summary of the analysis that's been going on, and look forward to digging into it some more. Maybe I'll assign some in my class next semester. So thanks again so much for your time, and happy election day. And
Yes, my pleasure.
All right, bye for now.
And best to all of you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye now.